Okay, so first I want to give you a preface to the book. Somebody picked it up and said, this book is way too difficult to read and understand. And I have to be honest with you, this is a typical book in biblical studies that you would read at the collegiate or the graduate level. And what it has is like almost just exhausting examples of the argument that he's making based on word study. And he says this, I think, pretty well. You can skim some of that. I'll tell you, my own strategy is I rarely read the footnotes. If that's up to you, you can always go back. The reason I picked it is not just to give us a little bit of exposure to the way that these kinds of books are written, but because the quality of the information is really high. Somebody asked me, why don't we read easier books? And the answer is, I haven't found an easier to read book that has the same caliber of information. So personally, I found this information to be refreshing, extremely thoughtful, and to offer some interpretive keys that unlock some of the ways of spirituality and Bible studies that have not been helpful for me. So I hope you find it similarly liberating. That said, it does take a little bit of kind of blazing a trail in the wilderness. I trust that you've been able to receive some value from it, and I'd like to hear if you have affirmations for the book first. So we'll do things that we didn't like later if we want to, or questions for the author, but I'd like to start with, was there a new idea or a new take on an idea that spoke to you or kind of expanded your vision of possibilities of interpretation from reading these first couple chapters?
Well, what particularly was meaningful to me was the thing about the thrones, because I found that very confusing before, and that completely explained very clearly, that they did in medieval time, they were chairs that were singing to their kings, and that's like completely weird. The throne is a symbol, like a crown, and it's like when you get to be in the throne, it's like this power comes upon you. It's kind of like some Shakespeare, Richard II and Henry V, where they're physically kind of fighting over the crown because that crown means so much. And then the onoma, the name, the power of the name as a separate entity from the person is like a whole new concept for me. And then I really got into the angels part. Man, angels are not what I thought they were. And it gives me a whole new concept of, how the early Bible was written and what people thought. So, I could talk about that, but let's just let you talk about it.
No, I don't need to be the expert, but I would share with you, I appreciate all the things that you just said. In fact, I've been thinking like, hey, for Lent, if I'm going to write blogs some more, I would like to write a blog like the 40 things I wish I knew. And that would be one of them. Mm-hmm. Angels in the Bible, because people talk about spiritual warfare, and to read this is like, nope, that's not what's going on at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I love the way he would present differing views, and he would present how this person, this expert, got this take on this scripture, and then he would present another view opposing that, and how this person got his or her take on the scripture. I love the fact that, and then he would say what his take is.
Yeah.
And that was helpful for me to help sort out what I want, what resonates with me, and why some of this stuff that I've been taught never did resonate. It it just didn't seem right, but I didn't have the data or the expertise to say, but this word could also mean this.
Yeah.
You know, so that was helpful to me.
And I know this isn't necessarily new, but because we've talked about this kind of obliquely, it's really interesting to me that angel means messenger, and that could be a human being, right?
Yes.
And that sometimes we mystify that and in some ways talk ourselves out of being involved in the story because that's for like special people instead of like messengers.
Yes. Yeah. And another concept that was helpful to me was that people in general, but especially then, would assign human qualities. They would personify power, or they would personify like fire or water. And so that's where we got some of the concepts, or they got some of the concepts of gods.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think one of the things I feel like he did in the book for me along that line is sometimes I think, oh, those ancient people, they're just superstitious and silly. And I think actually it's really helpful to hear that like these words that we sometimes think of as like metaphysical terms are really just trying to explain the qualities of something instead of trying to quantify. And I think in general, like some of my own experience in Bible study is like, oh, what are the qualities of demons instead of like, what are the qualities of unclean spirits? And I don't know where you are on this, but to hear like, hey, there's these, every nation has its own sort of like zeitgeist, and that's its angel, right? And so like, that's this like, this power, this quality. And obviously like it's really clear to see like during Nazi Germany, there was a particular like spiritual quality to the way culture and power were being normalized. And that's actually really perceptive. That's not a bunch of like gobbledygook, like that's like third eye qualitative description instead of this like weird hocus pocus, if that makes sense. And so in that sense, it's like very enriching for me to think about like, okay, like what's the quality, what's the angel of America?
Whoa. Whoa.
And I think that's really interesting because right now I would say I'm not even sure there is one. There seems to be like multiple American angels.
Warring each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually like to think about that is really insightful. It's not weird. Like it really, I think, helps put in context what's going on. I don't even care what your politics are. There's like some weird qualities to our national entity right now. What's the angel of St. Thomas like? I mean, that's a really interesting thing to think about,
What a profound thought. Once again, obviously I haven't read this yet, but the topic of angels has always been so fascinating for me. And I really, my dad in particular, who was a cradle to grave, totally devout Episcopalian, he really he would always tell me, kind of like be on your best behavior and be open, because you never know if there's an angel talking to you, and so you want to be able to receive the angels. And so I had a really amazing encounter one time that was I can't describe it, but anything else but miraculous. But I was in DC during the time of the shooter, when that sharpshooter with the kid this was about 20 years ago, and I had never been to DC when there was nobody on the streets. It was like being in a weird, I don't know. And it was cold, and I was there for work And I had gotten to the hotel, and I certainly couldn't afford the meal in the hotel on my government per diem. So I had been praying, God, let me go out and explore this city without, danger. And the only people that I ran into were like either homeless, or I literally saw people in the alley with needles in their, I was really scared. And this particular gentleman approached me, and it was quite apparent that he was homeless, but he was, for something just settled my spirit about him. And he was like, "Are you okay?" He was really kind. And I was like, "I'm really scared. I'm out here all by myself." And he said, "Well, don't you worry, I got you covered." And so I told him, I'm going to go get some dinner. And if I have any leftovers, I brought some leftovers. I ran into him, and, I was like, here's some food. Well, that whole week, if I cry, please forgive, that whole week, as I would go out at night, it was almost like the seas would part. Like anybody who would try to approach me that was sketchy looking, or, he would be like, "Oh, there's my girl." I mean, and I told my dad about this, and I was like, I really felt like he was an angel. And he said, "Yeah, that's what they are. Angels in skin. There you go."
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think it brings actually, again, I feel like that it makes the whole concept of angels like not just accessible, but imperative. The truth is we are all messengers. Which messages are we giving? Unclean ones, or are we representing God? I mean, I think that's, it's sort of like makes this whole like idea of spirituality very embodied. There's a little bit about names that I think is really interesting, because we have this weirdness, I think, in contemporary culture about names. And I've read a couple of resources recently that really have me thinking about this. So, many of us read this book, The 4 Vision Quest of Jesus, right? And there's this Native American tradition that when you have this vision, which I think we would probably use the word epiphany, you come back changed and you have a different name, because who you are substantially is so different. Your old name doesn't fit you anymore. And that seems very biblical, because it happens to Jacob, it happens to Abraham, it happens a couple of different places. In fact, it even happens to Jesus, because he gets the name that's above all names, right? I mean, that's his interesting bit. And I don't know if you've read, it's this children's fantasy book called Aragon, and it's this 4-part book, and it's about dragons and stuff like that. But in the book Aragon, there's this like old magic in the world, and the old magic is like this particular language. And when you know that language, you're able to like manipulate the energy in the world. And one of the most like sacred things is knowing something's true name. So like if you know the true name of fire, you can say the word fire, and energetically you can like conjure it. But the biggest thing that's going on in the book is there's this sort of like unclean spirit dragon rider named Galbatorix. And he goes about learning people's true names, because once you learn somebody's true name, you can control them. And so there's this really big deal in the book, like, do you actually want to know your true name or not? Because if you know your true name and you share it, people can own you. And there's this big struggle by the main character. His name's Aragon, but that's not his true name. That's his given name. And so it's really interesting to think about whether or not we know our true names. Do we want to know our true names? Right? And how vulnerable your true name makes you. And I share that not just so you'll go read some fantasy books. I actually think that's really what's behind names in the biblical world, because it turns out when you know a deity's name, like Baal or Anat or Asherah, you have some control over the deity. And when you read these stories in Canaanite mythology, people trick the gods out of their names, or they steal them. And that makes the Bible story unique, because God gives God's name. And a lot of times we read that commandment, don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And we think like, oh, when I trip, I shouldn't say, oh God, I hurt my toe. But that's not God's name. I mean, that's actually very distinct about when you say that why word. And ultimately, Judaism decided you never say that word. This is sort of interesting, right? Because like knowing God's name in some ways creates some intimacy and power. The question is, like, you can also defile yourself with that. I mean, so I share that because I feel like that's what he talks about with the unamas that's going on. And what's interesting about the Native American tradition, Aragon, and the Bible is that your true name can change. It's not set. It depends on who you choose to be. But when you choose enough, when you myelinate pathways in your brain, there is a name for that.
And that gives you the power. That empowers you to be who you choose to be.
Yeah.
I love that.
It's kind of, to me, it's not superstitious gobbledygook, like it's qualitative analysis. And a lot of us would default on, hey, my true name is what I do. And what we do informs who we are, of course, but those can be separate things. That seems to mirror with what he's talking about anyway. Any other affirmations you want to put forth from this work?
The thing that I thought was interesting in the introduction, where he said that the task of church is to unmask idolatry and recall powers to their created purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And he's saying that all powers aren't bad. The power in itself is not a bad thing.
Yeah. And
we were with the Brotherhood yesterday, we were talking about Jesus and his time, and it's important, I think, to, as we look at these words, to see them as they saw them. Because, when we talk about, say, gods, or, we would say, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, they would say that oak tree is a spirit. Well, they had those things to explain their world, and we explain our world much differently. And so that doesn't mean either of them are bad or good. It just means that they're different as their understanding. Astrophysics gives us a different view of the world. Okay, that's what I thought that introduction was very good.
I have another affirmation. I really appreciate that he gives a lot of information from Enoch, like 1 through 3, the Jubilees, Naphtali, stuff from the Qumran, Maccabees, stuff that we don't normally read. And he does say that he's giving a comprehensive, view. And I love how he equates it to geology, how you can't just look at a certain small area and make a bunch of inferences. You need to look at a huge amount of data for a clear picture to evolve.
Thank you. A lot of people don't realize that the Book of 1 Enoch almost made it into the Bible. At the Council of Chalcedon, it was on the chopping block and it got chopped down. The Book of James was on the chopping block and it barely got chopped in. But what he does with that particular book is really interesting. To almost make it as interesting, and that book so informed Christianity at his time that the Book of Jude is a cut and paste down of Enoch. There's not an original word in the Book of Jude. It's a cut and paste down of Enoch. Many Christians find that disturbing, but I think it's really interesting to hear that there's what we have relies on representative knowledge we haven't necessarily maintained. So there's mythology in books like Enoch, including things like who are the watchers, and this like how fallen the heavens were, which you can see in Genesis 6, where the sons of God look on the daughters of men and they produce the heroes of old. That's just weird. It's weird because we don't have all of that other context. That stuff didn't make it into the Bible, but it definitely was informing the scriptures that we do have.
Mhm.
Those books are called the Apocrypha, by the way. Now, Enoch's not in the Apocrypha. It's a book called the Pseudepigrapha. That's because nobody really thinks Enoch wrote that book. They put his name on it because he's like a special guy, like he walked with the Lord and was no more. So you should take whatever he says real seriously. I mean, that's kind of what they say. So that's a pseudepigraph, a falsely attributed writing. You can read that book. Turns out it's written in Ethiopic, not in Hebrew, not in Aramaic. The oldest one's in Ethiopic. It's African, which is really interesting. And you can read some of these other books like Jubilees. The book of Jubilees is in what we would call the Hebrew Bible Apocrypha. And many people don't know this. Of course, for the longest time, the church didn't consider the Apocrypha to be at the same level as the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, but they always included it as an appendix because they realized it informed the other writings. We ditched the Apocrypha in Protestantism during the Reformations, mainly because the Medici Pope said, the Pope is more important than the Bible, and I'll prove it. The Apocrypha is now in the Bible. And the Protestants said, no way, and we're not reading that anymore. That's why the Catholic Bible is different from the Protestant Bible. The Pope was trying to show his authority over the scriptures. So that created a conflict that didn't need to be created, in my own view. And that's why many of us have lost appreciation for the Apocrypha.
But now the Apocrypha is in a lot of the Protestant Bibles as an addendum.
And that's how it was meant to be. In fact, if you read the New Oxford Annotated Bible, you'll find the Apocrypha in there as well. But there is sort of this caveat. This is read as second-class sacred writing. It's not in the canon of Scripture, but it is an important appendix, and so important it should be included. Although, if you have a conflict between the Psalms and the Apocrypha, pick the Psalms. Does that make sense? I mean, that's the interpretive key. If you perceive a conflict, there are levels of authority. How about, yeah.
Excuse me. I agree with Rhonda in that the more sources we can access, the better. And then we can decide like priorities and where to put the emphasis. But you made the statement, Protestants said, no way. I've experienced that adamant no way multiple times in my history. I would say 35, 40 years ago, I was publicly in a Sunday school class shamed for bringing into the discussion some scientific psychological findings that validated what the Bible was teaching. And so it was my effort to say science and the Bible can go together and we can learn from both. And I was in no way saying anything negative about the scripture, but I was shamed. We don't talk about anything but the Bible in this class. Yeah. So the no way was pretty loud and clear for me then.
I really appreciate it. And I've sometimes I run into these quotes that I always try to figure out when to share, but I think it's really interesting to think about the powers that be in the church and the powers in tradition. And so I want to share this quote from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Maybe you've heard of him before, pretty influential social justice rabbi. Here's what he wrote. It is customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in modern society. It would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. Religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, insipid. When faith is completely replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks only in the name of authority rather than with the voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. I think Walter Wink would really appreciate that quote and how the arche of the church can become unclean, or it can point to something that is life-giving. And that, I think, is that interesting bit, like powers are amoral, but they can easily become immoral.
I wanted to share too, similar to Darlene, I too have run in my past, and actually in the present, with many who are adamant that anything that's quote outside of the Bible, and I'm like, you mean which Bible? The Bible you have today, the Bible you had in 16, which Bible? But no, they don't want to talk about that. But they can, the thing that comes up is the frequent, this is the last will and testament of the Lord Jesus Christ at the end of the Bible. And I'm like, wait a minute, but there were so many other things that the church controlled what came in out of the Bible. But anyway, that's been like an adamant, almost like there are people who either open to learning like we do, explore the history and the context that I think is very life-giving and very, in my feeling, it feels very much like what we as a church together benefit from, is so that we explore and we learn and how to be, how to love God more, how to receive God, how to be a better servant of God to his people. But yeah, I've run into that many times. Oh, and I also have not really, I'm open to if anybody has any success stories with how to open that door. Thank you.
Yeah, I kind of, because of that second question, I think that you only have success when people choose to ask you. I don't know that we ever are successful when we try to argue somebody into our own way of being. And it can be complicated because sometimes people really want to tell me what they believe, and I feel like I already know that. And that amounts to arrogance on my part. Be really great if I could just take the time to listen to something I think I already know and be curious, because there might be something I'm missing. But I think the truth is, I've never seen it go well that I tell you that you're wrong. Which is funny because I don't like being told that I'm wrong, but I sure like telling other people that they are. And there's a lot of spirituality wrapped up in that. Let me ask you this.
Thank you.
The Reverend Wink, who is an Episcopal or was an Episcopal priest, has passed on to larger life. But were he still around today, would you have questions for him, having read Introduction 1 and 2?
Well, I think I would like to ask him if he thinks the church is fulfilling the mission today. Based upon what he has begun to outline.
Mm-hmm. I would be curious for his analysis too. My gut says he might say in some ways, or he might say in some places. But if we're talking church with a capital C, I think he's trying to take us to task a little bit.
Well, would he see the same powers today that he saw, say, 30 or 40 years ago?
That's a great question. I will tell you that the Reverend Wink was openly gay when he was still alive. And I wonder what his experience would be with that as an Episcopal clergy person. I wonder about that and how that has changed. His other books, he's ultimately not a pacifist. He's like a non-violent confrontationalist. That comes out in the other books, and he parses out the difference between those. And I think his commentary is as relevant now as it was 30 years ago in that area, because thinking about the either or, like violence and pacifism, is like this false binary way of thinking, and very few people like can live into this third way. It would be interesting to hear how he sees that being embodied in the church. Yeah, be really interesting.
I would like to see us follow up this study once we get through this with the groundwork that we need. I'd like to see us follow up with perhaps one of his other books. One in particular that I really like is The Powers That Be.
Yeah.
And he talks about the third way in that book more extensively. And I love the third way and how he presents it as an alternative. He was such an activist that I would think to be that much of an activist in various ways of our thinking, Christian theology, that he saw that the church needed a lot of change.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I share your interest in going forward. So he's written 4, and that's what I'm looking at my shelf: Unmasking the Powers, Engaging the Powers. There's another one, Transforming the Powers. And then his like summative work before he died is The Powers That Be. So I guess there's actually 5 of them. To be honest, books 2 and 3 are more exciting for me, 2, 3, and 4. But like I say, this book is about laying that foundation so that we can. Sometimes you read a book and you say, oh, the author's saying that angels are like qualitative representations. Well, that's a weird idea. And so what's great about this book is he says, I didn't make that up. Here's where that idea comes from, over and over and over and over and over and over again, so that you're really able to say like, oh, instead of this being Walter Wink's like wackadoo idea, like, oh, maybe that's what the Bible was describing all along. And somehow we took it so literally, we forgot to take it seriously. So I'm with you. I hope we can continue to read through and enjoy. To me, what's great about this book, and I would like to ask him at the same time, is I grew up very much in this sort of like, forgive me for saying this, but like kind of superstitious, magical worldview in which like the forces of good and evil are like struggling, and God will win in the end, but in the middle, like we're not real sure about all that. And like I think I remember hearing at youth camp that the devil has a plan to destroy your life and is actively working on that, and people can be possessed by these like magical demonic kind of forces. I am really sure that people can be possessed by demonic forces. I just don't think of the magical kind anymore. I think about people getting swept up in the Third Reich's marches, or I think about people getting swept up in like, hey, I refused to bear any inconvenience on behalf of my neighbor. All inconveniences are hardships. I think we can get swept up in those demonic forces, but they're not magic, they're qualitative forces. And I heard a really good contrast to that this morning. I was listening to this book called How to Be Miserable, 40 Strategies for Deepening Your Misery. And number 39 is to be fashionable instead of stylish. And so fashion is about conforming to other people's dictates about what's appropriate to dress and speak and how to be. And style is about living into your own gifts and graces unapologetically. And I do think there's a lot of power in fashion. And I think we don't empower style very well. I thought that was interesting language, fashion and style. What Brene Brown does is she says fashion is fitting in and style is about belonging. Fitting in is when you only belong based on your adherence. Belonging is when we fundamentally believe we all go together. So you do you. And that's style. It's really interesting because most fashionistas that I know have very little style. I might be one of those people. I don't know. So it's always interesting to think about, am I fashionable or stylish? And the powers that are represented in that. And of course, like, lest I seem like I'm speaking too obliquely, when we talk about like the archons or the archetypes, I mean, church is one of the most fitting in places in my experience I've ever been. And if you ask certain questions, you don't fit in anymore. Or like Darlene said, if you try to bring in like extra canonical sources into an equation, you may not fit in anymore, which is weird. And it's a fine line to walk, right? Like how can you be stylish while inviting other people to do it instead of inviting people to adopt the fashion of your own style? That's an interesting dynamic. As clergy, as a congregation, as church with a capital C.
That's why church attendance is down so much, because people see it as being irrelevant.
I definitely think that's one of the reasons. There's a lot of other reasons. Some of them are mysterious to me. And I do think what's interesting, Tim, about like church attendance and involvement, some of the churches that are big are very much fashion churches. They're much fit in.
Oh yeah,
They
Some of the
are.
belonging churches are small, almost
Yeah.
small by design. And sometimes I see belonging places and I'm like, why aren't people knocking down the doors to come belong here? And I think this is where he talks about truly demonic powers. We're so accustomed and acculturated to fitting in that belonging is scary.
Well, these big churches, like say the Woodlands Church, they're entertainment venues. They are not churches.
I'm a religious entertainer. I produce videos on the internet.
Yes, thank you.
You know, like I think the difference is like when we're able to entertain something and then like change our practice, then that's great entertainment. You know, some movies are really entertaining for me. If they change my practice, then that's the ultimate form of entertainment. But if I sit and watch and leave unchanged, or if I double down on my bigotry and prejudice, then I would say that's demonic entertainment.
If entertainment doesn't to make you to think or to ponder, then it's not really very good.
I appreciate that. You know, I think something that Walter Wink would say, and I struggle with this because I don't know how you get out of it, is to think about what forms of entertainment we ascribe value to. And I was talking to a parent the other day about like, hey, what are some good movies for my kids? And it's really hard because almost every movie I watch includes the myth of redemptive violence.
Mm-hmm.
Almost every movie that I watch is like, has structural misogyny in it. All the Disney movies, every single one of them are based on those two myths. Oh, what about Frozen? The characters are leads. That's, yeah, but they're anomalies. You know, they're predicated on things like when there's opposition, you beat it instead of be reconciled with it. And this is an interesting thing he's going to do in the powers book. You don't have to defeat demonic powers. You can help them be reconciled to who God wants them to be. And that's an interesting thing. So instead of fighting racism, the question is, how do we convert racism to be a power that's life-giving? That's a tough one.
That's the reason why I don't particularly care for American films. I will watch British or French, or Scandinavian, something like Save Water for Chocolate, or something, something that doesn't have a gun in it. I am absolutely convinced that violence in the United States goes back to the entertainment industry.
And I want to follow up on that and say, like, I think there's something very like human about being entertained by violence, because you read the Hebrew Bible, it's full of it. The question is whether or not we want to sanction it or whether we want to learn from it. And most churches I have been a part of say, like, yeah, God did say, slay the infidel. And that's real scary. That's real scary.
Perhaps he was talking about not somebody outside of us, perhaps somebody inside of us.
We all make interpretive decisions, and sometimes we don't recognize that we get to make these choices. And, when I read those, I think, oh, I do think like that. And here are the natural consequences of that thinking. And I don't want those. And boy, it's real scary when we put God behind our own ideas, isn't it? I like doing it. It's just like the definition of sin, right? So I hope it was interesting, because I'm one of those named powers in the Bible. I am the Prince of Israel. Michael in Hebrew means who is like him among the gods. And, it's interesting to think that even the nation of Israel has an angel, even though it's like supposed to have God. And he brings that tension up. And I want to name for you, because it's not in here, that this shows up in some Jewish midrash. And even in some of the rabbinic commentary. And there's this story I think I've told you before, that once upon a time, the Hebrew people are stuck at the Sea of Reeds, and the Egyptians are coming at them. And the archangel Michael says to God, you've got to deliver these people. You've got to deliver them. And all the other powers in heaven, the angel of Egypt, the angel of Babylon, etc., they say, no, God, these people are getting what they deserve. You can't deliver them. And so the angel Michael goes down to the city of Pithom, one of the fortified cities that the Hebrew slave builds, and picks up a brick and brings it back to heaven. And inside the brick is the corpse of a Hebrew child who was, as a slave, building that city and was interred in the brick. And all the powers say, oh, well, God, you've got to punish the Egyptians. And so the Reed Sea opens, the Reed Sea closes on all of the Egyptians, and all the powers go, yay, God, you showed them. And God goes, be silent. I just lost thousands of my children. I mean, this is sort of this interesting story that's told from the Hebrew perspective about the nature of both the powers, how powers are fickle and will look for things like revenge, and God's empathy and compassion in the middle of like seemingly vengeful moments. This depicts God as legitimately heartbroken over having done this thing. And that story is like 2,000 years old. I almost wish that when we had a study Bible, instead of the notes that say like, the Sea of Reeds might have been in Mesopotamia, I wish it said, here's this cool story from Jewish Midrash about what powers are. That'd be a good study Bible. For some reason, nobody wanted to put that one together. But to me, it really brings the text alive because it invites, like, layers of meaning, what compassion is like, and it allows you to move from a prescriptive read of the text, like go do this, to something that's descriptive, and here are the consequences that come when you make decisions like these.
So when can we expect a brand new Bible?
Boy, I don't know. It turns out there's all these new translations. And I always tell people when we do a Bible study, if you've got a study Bible, it's not great. The people who write notes in a study Bible, they got a master's degree. So don't fool yourself. These are written by people who went to seminary for 3 years.
Well, I was suggesting that perhaps maybe you could write one.
Oh, Lord, nobody would want to read it. I once upon a time, I wrote a book. I think it sold 300 copies. I think I bought like 70 of them. So
Well, I think we
have one.
Well, I think some people on the screen have one, and that's definitely something like I want to try to do, even for my own sake, because there is a difference between writing and speaking, less and less as I get older. But, being able to put that information out so there's a competing narrative, whether people read it or not, seems important to me. And I'm getting to the point where I don't even have to be right anymore. It's just nice if there's options. So I don't mind chasing like crazy things. That seems really important, though, that chasing crazy things allows other people to do it. And the criterion is like, who gets life out of it in the end? Anything you want to take Professor Wink to task on before we go? You want to poo-poo him at all?
The thing that I found he cites a bunch of Bible quotations, and if you want, and to follow up on that, is very, very time consuming.
Yes. Well, most people aren't going to do it. Let's just be honest about it. And if you do, it's real cool of you. If you're looking for an easy way to do it, and I don't care how well versed you are in sword drills, you can just open up BibleGateway.com and you can just type the reference in and they come up really fast. One of the things I love about Bible Gateway is you can change the translation with the click of a mouse. So you can go from the Message to the RSV to the NRSV. It even has like the scriptures in Hindi. It has them in Hebrew, it has them in Greek. So if that's your thing, you can do that. Graciela, you could pull up 4 versions in Spanish like that, and you could read the different ways it's been translated into Spanish.
Wow. Okay. We are going to close so we can go to church.
Yes, got to go to mass.
Well, me too. I'm really grateful that you're here and looking forward to reading chapter 3 and discussing it next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Thank you. God bless everybody.